For our assignment on political correctness, we dissected the arguments of Peterson, Fry, Goldberg, and Dyson, and then organized them into standard form. For Peterson, his conclusion on political correctness was that fundamentally categorizing individuals with groups and the associated tyranny those groups have perpetuated leads to tribalism, not progress. Some of his premises and beliefs are that humans need a collective narrative to unite us, or else there is no peace.
We essentially need something approximating a low-resolution grand narrative to unite us. And we need a narrative to unite us because otherwise we don't have peace.
The West has reasonably effective hierarchies that have created a higher standard of living than the rest of the world and the rest of history. The narrative that allows this to occur is the narrative of the sovereign individual. The best way to interact and solve issues in society is individual to individual discourse. Collectivist narrative is being cultivated in universities and academia. Hierarchies tend to be tyrannical and corrupt, but have systems in place that check this tyranny. Hierarchies create groups of displaced people, and the left is the proper voice of those displaced people. For Fry, his conclusion on political correctness was that the political correctness doesn't work. Some of his beliefs are that rage, hostility, intolerance, etc. has to stop. The with us or against us narrative is creating a gulf between the right and the left. The right and the left have stopped listening to each other.
I think all this has got to stop. This rage, resentment, hostility, intolerance. Above all, this with us or against us, certainty. A grand canyon has opened up in our world. The fissure, the crack, grows wider every day. Neither on each side can hear a word that the other shrieks, and nor do they want to.
A common human failing is to be more concerned about being right rather than being effective. Political correctness is more concerned with being right about intolerance rather than effectively combating it. Distrust conformity and orthodoxy in society. Progress is not achieved by preaching morality, and progress is achieved by the discoveries and ideas of madmen, hermits, heretics, dreamers, and skeptics. For Goldberg, his conclusion on political correctness was that rolling back policies promote social progress in the name of battling politically correct culture does not feel like a progressive step for Americans. Some of his beliefs are: political correctness isn't just a term for left-wing excesses or people on Twitter being terrible.
Political correctness isn't just a term for left-wing excesses on college campuses or people being terrible on Twitter.
Political correctness, as used by Jordan Peterson, can delegitimize attempts for women, ethnic minorities, and the LGBTQ to overcome discrimination or to argue that the discrimination they face is real. A quote from Jordan Peterson was, "People who hold the idea that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy don't want to admit our current hierarchy is predicated by competence," then reflects that this seems insane as the president is Donald Trump. This aforementioned quote shows that there is an assumption that highlights a worldview that any challenges to the current hierarchy are written off as political correctness. Also, is in a debate about free speech. Quote from Jordan Peterson was, "The evil trinity of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. If you hear those three words, equity, diversity, and inclusivity, you should step away from that because you know who you are dealing with, and that is not acceptable." Peterson says Frozen is politically correct propaganda as well. And finally, Peterson floated the idea of creating a course database so that students can avoid postmodern critical theory. Finally, Dyson's argument for political correctness is that political correctness has been made divisive by politically conservatives and whites because it takes away their monopoly on power, and more specifically, the power to say or do racist, homophobic, or offensive things to specific identity groups. His main beliefs and premises are: how has political correctness become so us versus them mentality? That the left came up with political correctiveness, left adopted it to be more self-critical and accommodating of the language or things they did.
So what's interesting then is that political correctness has transmogrified into a caricature of the left. The left came up with the term political correctness, shall I remind you?
Argues that group politics were invented by the oppressive class, the whites, because of their invention of race. Invention of race was used to dominate the groups created by race and racism. Finally, patriarchy was created to monopolize men's hold on power. Jordan Peterson's argument in the Monk debate, "Be it resolved, what you call political correctness, I call progress," provided content that was challenged throughout the entirety of the episode. To evaluate his argument, we must first question what gives him authority to take the position that he assumed, the con side of debate. Peterson is a professor at the University of Toronto and is considered a public intellectual and media personality when it comes to topics such as the one discussed in the Monk debate. It is fair to say that Peterson has been exposed to the notion of political correctness a fair amount, given his career as a professor at a university, which verifies his authority to make the argument he did. Peterson's argument against political correctness and its progress was based upon the conclusion that fundamentally categorizing individuals within groups and the associated tyranny those groups perpetuate leads to tribalism and not progress. To determine the validity and soundness of Peterson's argument, it is essential to consider the truth of this claim and the truth of the premises he employs to support it. Peterson sets up his argument in a way that is easy to break down into standard form, basing his argument on a variety of premises that include the necessity of common narrative to unite humans, the effectiveness of Western hierarchy, the importance of the individual, collective mindset ignoring the individual and becoming a game for power contrary to free speech, the failures of hierarchies, and systems employed by the West to prevent them.
That hierarchies tend to produce situations where people stack up at the bottom, and that the dispossessed in hierarchies need a political voice, which is the proper voice of the left, by the way, and the necessary voice of the left.
And the necessity for a voice to represent those who are dispossessed by hierarchies. Peterson does well acknowledging that to make a knockdown argument against the idea of political correctness is not possible. He exposed failures with ideas about the side he argued for and followed them with solutions to address possible counter-arguments as well. Peterson's argument is one that is structured well, and it includes relevant and effective examples to support his conclusion. Though there are obvious flaws with his argument, as with any argument, Peterson did a good job of challenging political correctness in its progress.
Peterson's main standpoint is that the hierarchy we live in relies on competence, and any person who believes we are in an oppressive patriarchy is therefore incompetent. On the other hand, Michelle's views are pro-political correctness, support of minority groups, pro-individuality, pro-women in power, anti-misogyny, and she holds the idea that people have the right to define their own identities. Peterson's views are held in anti-political correctness, anti-generalization of groups, pro-individualism, and personal accountability. Michelle's interpretation is that anybody who disagrees with the hierarchy is advocating for political incorrectness. Using the background research Michelle Goldberg conducted on Jordan Peterson, she found that his posts did not support diversity, equity, and inclusion, creating a predetermined disapproval from him and his followers.
When, for example, the kind of, one of the best-selling and most prominent intellectuals in the world right now says in an interview that maybe the Me Too movement has shown that this whole experiment of men and women working together is just not working. Or, maybe if women don't want the workplace to be sexualized, they shouldn't be allowed to wear makeup.
I
right?
didn't say that.
Well, Google
I
it.
didn't say
it was
that.
a Vice interview. Google it.
Yeah, well.
So.
Peterson made a very good point. One of his opponents, Michelle Goldberg's views stemmed from a different point of view. Based on the tone set in her introduction, Michelle Goldberg holds a bias against Peterson due to his misogynistic attacks on women who disagree with him. To refute Peterson, Goldberg states that not everyone can avoid generalization due to certain situations. For example, African Americans in police brutality situations or women wanting reproductive control of their bodies. As Peterson is not a fan of certain leftists, Michelle counters this criticism of pro-political correctness by acknowledging that social leftists can invade people's thoughts on the concept. Peterson believes that by generalizing racial or other minority groups, individuals are able to keep their rights but are not held accountable for their actions due to the ability to hide in the minority group. Based on the two arguments, we can conclude that these individuals had conflicting views in both political and personal values and views.
Peterson's argument strives to display how the lack of respect towards an individual's free speech and value is nonsensical. PC culture strives towards people being represented through groups and not as individuals. Therefore, their speech is on behalf of others in their group and is constantly in efforts to gain power for the group in a hierarchy system, which is tyrannical when in pursuit of power placement. That is why there are checks and balances in order to limit this abuse of tyranny and power. Peterson's argument is therefore valid as it highlights how tribalism forms through the association of people being part of a group and not their own person. The reason this causes further issues is because the people in the group are now at the mercy of the group they're associated with. Therefore, Peterson's argument that people should be addressed as an individual rather than on the level of a group is valid, as it pushes for the idea that everyone has their own way of being addressed and has their own self-identity. This also allows for a system of accountability, in which people are unable to fall back into their group to hide after conducting certain business that is seen as unfavorable to the public. An example could be riots, in which specific groups of people are protesting something. If one person were to actually rob a store, the person themselves should be held accountable. However, the group is instead associated with it, currently, because they are viewed as part of a group rather than the sake of political correctness as an individual. With all this in mind, it is valid that Peterson's argument pushes for a lack of political correctness in order to enforce individuality and accountability.